There he is. There he is. Luc, how are you doing?
Very good, thank you. How are you,
All
Andre?
right. Good. Thank you. So for those of you who don't know Luc, Luc is an associate professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies at Queen's University. His research interests lie in the general area of team dynamics with a specific focus on topics such as cohesion, social identity, team building, and subgroups slash cliques. Although much of his research resides in the context of sport, is also interested in other high performance groups, which is really, really interesting, the military and surgical teams. He serves on the editorial boards for several top sports psychology journals and has consulting experience with athletes and teams ranging from developmental to elite levels of competition. Luc, thanks so much for being with us. And I'll give you the microphone. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Let me just Great. Well, I've really enjoyed the previous conversations and presentations, so thanks for the invitation. So I will begin by thanking Frank, Andre, and Wayne for the invitation to be a part of this timeout session. By way of introduction, my lab is generally interested in team dynamics. And to do that, we've started a substream where we do look at other high-performing contexts, and what we're really trying to do there is just figure out what we can learn from teams to bring back to sport. So when Frank first approached me about speaking today, he suggested maybe I speak about some of the work we've done with a military team in particular that might be of interest. So that's what I'm going to do today. So just to begin, and I certainly don't have to tell people here about this, but really, when you think about sport, leading a group of people is quite complex, and leading any type of group with people of different, people are different, and no two people are the same, so no two groups are the same, right? So leading an organization or a group is quite challenging. And what I've personally seen from the academic literature, at least from leadership perspective, is we have quite a bit of understanding, or quite a bit of knowledge about professional knowledge. So things like strategies, skill development, systems. There's also a really growing body of literature specifically about interpersonal skills. So things like how you might treat your players, how to motivate players, a person-centered approach. But there really seems to be comparatively less about things like facilitating teammate interactions and relationships, for example, or even more broadly at the team level. So team dynamics and things like team building and cohesion or condition setting. So one of the things that I thought would be interesting to talk about today that I thought coaches could really consider, think through, is this critical component of creating a high performance environment. And that's the selection and integration of new members, because that really does change the dynamic of a group, but it's super critical. Now, there's a number of reasons why this would be important to consider, right? And some people even suggest that this is one of the most critical pieces of creating a high performance environment. So the first is that the people you're bringing into that organization, whether it's through drafts, trades, free agency, they really represent the future of your program. So you want to make sure that those people have the knowledge, the skills, the abilities, so the KSAs that they call it, that really match what you need as an organization specific to your group. The other reason, and it's more general, is that this is a perfect opportunity to ensure that newcomers really realize that they were selected for a reason and that they're bringing something special, tangible to the table. So otherwise you would have gone with someone else, right? It's also, and there is evidence to suggest that this is the time frame when organizations have the greatest influence on their newer members. So it's a critical period, and you really want to take or make sure that this opportunity is not wasted. So as I've said, I'm going to talk about a team that we've worked with in the past that I think does some really interesting things that align really nicely with sport. So the case that I'll chat about is the Canadian Forces Snowbirds, who are really the ambassadors for the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Canadian Armed Forces more generally. So they're really known for their formation flying, which is depicted in the top right corner here. But what really interested us to this group and attracted us to them, other than obviously the fact that they're a high performing group, was that the membership is highly transient. So in other words, every year they're replacing close to half of their team, which means that they have to have a very systematic and purposeful way of selecting the right people and bringing them into that culture quite quickly. So I'm going to just show a quick clip for the international people here who might not be familiar with the group. But what I want you to do is just look at the environment. So keep in mind that they're flying at about 300 to 350 knots, which is about 600 kilometers an hour. So just have an eye for the proximity and the symmetry that they're demonstrating as a group. And just think about the level of trust and accountability that would be necessary when you're functioning in a space like this. So just for sake of time, I'll stop the video, but it gives you a sense of where they're at in terms of a team. So obviously this isn't a research talk, but I think it's important to see where the research process was. And we followed this team for several years, and we engaged in a variety of different methods to understand how they function. So we used observation, interviews, field notes, shadowing, and eventually it all ended with kind of an experiential flight. And this last piece I think is really important because going up with this team was a huge benefit for me because I was really able to see how they functioned in their own environment and some of the things, some of the data that we were collecting and listening to them speak about it, I was able to witness and see how that was actually put through in process, which was great. So there's generally two phases to their selection process, and I'm simplifying it quite a bit, but I think it gives a really good indication. And I don't have time to talk about everything, but I've handpicked some things that I think could be and should be maybe considered in the realm of sport. So the first is about the invitation, so the application and preliminary assessment process. The one thing that I think was really novel and impactful was this idea of a team-focused approach. So when picking the candidates, every single member of the current team had a say. So as you can see from the top of this quote, they call it a red card or a veto right. So if anyone doesn't think that a person is a fit or could work with the group, then they're automatically not invited. And that's kind of end of story. Now they take this very seriously. You can see in the bolded section on the bottom of the quote. But obviously there has to be grounds for this decision, but that's really impactful. And I know that obviously that's not possible in sport. You wouldn't expect your athletes to have total say in this process, but having input could be really powerful, right? So maybe it's about having representative subgroups of athletes that are involved in dialogue and work with the coach and the management group through the process. The current team would feel stronger in terms of identity and ownership, but more so the incoming athletes will know that the current teammates provided input and actually approved them coming in, which could be really powerful. So once they've identified who could be potential members of this team, they invite them to this on-site process, if you will. What I'd like to do what I'd like to have you do, I guess, after this talk, is think about your typical selection process and consider the specific barriers like time or resources that you might encounter, but also the advantages that your particular organization or your situation might have. So I say this because I think this particular group or team has done a great job of making the most of what they've been given. So I picked three things that I think this group did really well to pick the right people while also showing them exactly what it's like to be a member of this group. And it's making the most of the process because they have to do this in a very limited 2-week window with pilots that have never flown this type of aircraft before and who are progressing from ground training with this plane to four-plane formation flying. So what I've bolded here in the bottom of this quote from the team lead at the time simply shows that by the time camp is over, they want these pilots to know exactly what the expectations are and what it feels like to be a member of this group. So I'll start with the flight briefings. These aren't new to people in sport by any means, but there are a few things that are novel twists, I think, that you might find interesting. So if you can picture this as a conference table, and before and after every flight, that's where they congregate in their meeting room. So they begin the pre-flight brief with everyone, and they state their individual goals, objectives for that particular flight. Immediately post-flight, each pilot talks about how they did generally and in terms of their specific objectives. Then each pilot around the table speaks to the honesty and the accuracy of that individual's evaluation. And then they actually watch the flight objectively as well. So here's just a quote from one of the soloists at the time, just saying how important this process is for actually building accountability and trust within the group. So what I think is particularly relevant and could be brought to sport is the immediacy of the process. So they're expected to control their emotions and do this immediately post-flight, which is a little bit different in some of the sports settings where we normally allow people to go away, consider things, think about it, cool off, and then talk about it the next day, for example. Another interesting piece is how they talk about this being more than just skill and systems. It's typically what we use in sport, but they use it here to talk about how critical it is for establishing buy-in and doing things right. So you can imagine talking about things like playing to the whistle or chasing down balls, for example, in sport. Something else that I think they did really well was this mentorship process. So if you can imagine the typical formation here, we start with the boss lead, then we have the inners, we have the line astern, the outers, and the soloists. And really each of these is a mirror in the formation. So what the team does really well is they do their best to have a second and a first year in each of these dyads. And these people are meant to be the go-to person for that individual related to flight questions, to formally teaching them their roles, what it's like, but also more generally about general life and transitions to moose jaw and things like that, for example. So maybe there are opportunities in sport for a more formal process that can be put in place to help individuals during this transition process. The last one that I'll talk about is an example of using established protocols and traditions for purposely looking at things that you find important in your organization. So for example, every year, these individuals have a team dinner, and it's designed to be a celebration at the end of training camp to thank the candidates for all of their hard work and preparation coming in. But they have things like mock reporter interviews and an open bar, and it's meant to be more social in nature. But what they're really doing is using this as an opportunity also to see how people act in a social setting when they don't think they're being evaluated. So specifically, like I said, they're looking at who cared enough to do their homework and learn about the organization that they might become members of. They're also maybe looking at how people act when they don't think that they're being evaluated, right? So that can be really powerful. So are there things that you can do or that you're specifically looking for in terms of character? And could there be things like picking up equipment or how people treat support staff or things like that? Or maybe even considering speaking or getting feedback from people in the support staff to see how people are interacting when they're not being evaluated. So what we have here is essentially an example of the process where this team is trying to find the ideal fit for certain holes within their organization. But what this group also did explicitly was show these people who they are as an organization. So as you can see, I've kind of turned this to Snowbird culture. But because of time, I won't talk about the skill and the teamwork. There are a few things about professionalism that I'll like to bring up. So first, and it's something that I think we can do a much better job in sport generally, is the appreciation showed for the incoming members. So this first quote is one from one of the candidates that shows they purposely called them candidates and not rookies. And this isn't because there's inherently anything wrong with the term rookie, but the vets told me that this is basically, they don't want to undermine what these people are bringing to the table. Right? So they're the elite of the elite, and they should be treated as such and celebrated with what they're bringing into the organization. The second is immediately, they make it very clear that you have to be able to have hard discussions and accept criticism regardless of who it's from. So the reason is that it's all about making the team better. And in this particular context, there's huge safety implications, but it's also critical for sport. So right from the beginning, as an example, the vets were extra hard on each other to set the tone and to show newcomers what the expectations were in terms of accountability. So my last point is about physical space. And I know and I've seen that a lot of sport teams do a really good job of this, but you can never overlook the power of physical space and the messages that you can convey to members through their use. So here are just a few pictures, and you can see the bolded text of an incoming candidate about their first entry into the space and how that made them feel. So you should speak to your athletes about what space actually means to them and which areas most represent what it feels like to be a member of that group or what the culture is like. How could it be improved, or how they might be included in the process. So this is really important for incoming members, but also for the team as a whole. So as a summary, this is how we've kind of made sense of the process. So they use a series of purposeful mechanisms throughout the selection process to pick the right people, right? But they also make sure that while they're doing this, they're showing the organization's mission and more generally their culture as they're doing it. So to finish, I think three takeaways that I wanted to get across here are that the first is all about picking ideal candidates, but knowing what those ideal candidates are for your particular organization and really thinking through purposeful ways that you can identify those. So if you don't purposely do so, you're in a way leaving your eventual success and future as an organization to chance. Next, you want to make sure that you're quite transparent in the process. So if you're showing incoming people exactly what it is and the expectations of the group. So things like appreciation from veterans or accepting criticisms and things like that. The last one is beginning to integrate as soon as possible and making sure that what people see during those early visits and early integration is exactly what they will get when the season starts. So congruency between impressions and actual day-to-day operations are incredibly important for transitions and satisfaction of members. So thanks so much for your time. Thanks for listening, and happy to field any questions.
Thanks so much, Luc. That was really awesome. I'm always amazed on what we could learn from other environment. And I'm going to ask you a question. You know, in sport, and the question will be around feedback, as you talked about it a little bit. In sport, most of the time, the feedback is originally provided from the coach to the athlete. But when we look at research, it seems that most of the feedback is given like between the athletes, and it's happening during the training, it's happening at home, on social media, it's happening everywhere. So I was just curious to know what you notice in your military / Snowbirds environment about feedback, if there was some sort of an environment where feedback was given between the participants.
Yeah, definitely. And I think feedback is really one of the key features that they talk about in terms of building accountability and trust. And in fact, during that selection process, what they even say is that you have to be able to accept criticism and you have to be able to voice it and speak it to other people, to hold people accountable. And one of the things that they were talking about is they're almost more interested in people being able to own that and to discuss and disclose those things rather than people actually making mistakes. So what they found was that if they had an incoming candidate and someone that was not willing to accept that they were making mistakes or was trying to hide mistakes and not voice those things, to them that was a deal breaker. That was not the type of person that they could bring into the organization. So, and they talked about that explicitly to these incoming people about this is something that you need to be able to do, and it's really an important feature. So making that known and having those discussions as a group, I think, is really important.
So coaches, not only you need to be better at giving feedback to your athletes, but we also need to be better at teaching our athletes how to be better at giving feedback between each other, because at the end of the day, this is happening. Luc, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today, and thanks for being on time also and finishing on time. This is awesome because you got a busy schedule. I'll turn it over to Wayne to follow up on the program here.
Great, thank you.
Great,
Thank you,
thanks, Luc.